Welcome, everybody. I'm Captain Ross Memphis Pambram. With me, as always, my friend, the co-host, the president, Lawrence Gervais. We're broadcasting from Calgary in Region 3, the Métis Nation of Alberta, historic part of the Métis Nation homeland. We'd like to acknowledge these lands that are the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, and with whom we share this land on the basis of our historical and ongoing relationship. I know I'll get a laugh from you guys. Thank you very much.
You made up a tribe there. It's pretty good.
Pretty sure I don't want to fight with them. We'd like to say thank you to all of our First Nation friends, to the Métis settlements, to the Métis brothers and sisters and families, and also give thanks to our elders who give us guidance, and as always, to Mother Earth. And with that, Lawrence, let's get started on the squeaky wheel, because I know we have a wonderful guest who's coming on today who's really made some ardent strides with some of the education that's happening within the community, or that's available to our community. And I know we always have people who are committed. This is a pretty extensive project that he's completed. So we're going to jump to him shortly. That's Mike Parks, who's the owner of Michif Media. But before we jump to that, Lawrence, and I know we have our usual sort of format that we like to follow, but let's jump right into what's happening regionally. Because before I get into last week, take us through with what's happening right now.
Well, I mean, right now, currently, we have, because of COVID, we had these constitution commissions that were supposed to happen in the province and roundtables that were supposed to begin. But because of COVID and the distancing, we weren't able to communicate to the individuals that we kind of chose to represent Region 3 in those commissions. So we're kind of, I know that they're looking at ways to do it virtually. So, people can give feedback to the new constitution that we're developing with the Métis Nation of Alberta. And it's all around the self-government agreement that we've set up with Canada. So that'll be rolling out in the near future. It is Christmas season, so we're trying to have one final virtual meeting with our seniors. We're trying to have another final virtual meeting with our businesses.
Oh, that's right. Mixer. Thank you.
That's right.
December 17th, folks, 6 p.m.
Yeah. And then trying to gather with our staff in a way that's virtually too, but also fun. And then looking at ways to do 2021 a little bit better. The new vaccine rollout is hopefully will allow us to achieve more, connection later on, but it probably won't happen for another 3 or 4 months. But that's just, it's a good thing that it's rolling out now. At least it'll relax some of the restrictions and we can hopefully open our office to everybody again.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about that vaccine. You're right. When do we start getting back to normal? Folks, last week, big shout out, thank you to Dr. Raja Singh, who brought the conversation about point of care tests, how the rollout is likely going to work when it comes to the vaccine, why the vaccines are important, and to touch on a little bit of that, because our conversation about the rollout, folks, right now what's happening is we've probably seen 10% of the population, seemingly, Dr. Dina Hinshaw says, have had COVID or exposed to COVID through the herd immunity. If we start vaccinating people and create a larger population that has built up antibodies and protection, we're going to see a larger number of people who are protected. At the end of the day, not everybody in every situation for every vaccine gets protected, but the more we do protect, and those individuals who are vital and essential to our safety and our security, the doctors, the nurses, the first responders, the people who take care of our elderly in the aged homes, if we can get to them, then we're making huge strides, and we will start to see larger reopening within our communities. And I take nothing back from the people who run the restaurants, the servers, the people who run our gyms. You are vital to all of those essential workers for helping build their strength. So I'm excited. I'm excited that this product is coming. I'm still, like anybody else, trying to figure out how the rollout is going to happen. But I know we have, after listening to Dr. Singh, there's right people in place who are part of that decision making.
Yeah, and hopefully they are making the decision and not it's less political and it's more about science and we just keep moving forward and we can bring this to an endemic situation rather than a pandemic. And you are right. I think what they label as an endemic is 50% of the total world population having some type of immunity to it. So, and then once that happens, then it'll probably be just a rollout of a vaccine once every year or maybe every couple of years. And then we just keep moving forward as society back to normal again.
Yeah. And a lot of Kenny threw himself on the sword. Kenny tried to, suggest that, they tried certain things. It's difficult. The NDP right now will say anything because they're the opposition, that everybody's wrong. I think it's difficult. They tried to work at figuring out how do you manage an economy? What's the best way? Alberta was struggling as it was. But I think, I like to think that each lesson that we're learning along this journey and watching all of the other provinces, if we can continue to monitor what's happening around the world and react as best we can and utilize the tool of the vaccine that's coming and get it out there, I honestly think that's the role of the politicians. Make the best informed decision based on the support that they're getting from the science and then defend it. Or am I wrong?
I live in I live in that Métis world where, I don't, I do trust the government. I have a very good relationship with them. But at the end of the day, I'm Métis. I make my own decisions, right? I carry this human life on the earth and I have to protect the community as best I can, right? So, and Region 3. But, I do agree. It's a tough decision for them because they're the ones that are making the decision. But, how do we trust that? Are they getting the right information? Is it because of something else that they're making decisions upon? Is it a businessman who's making the decisions for them, or is it science? How are they constructing that decision at the end of the day?
And that's a great point. We've already seen them say, the politicians say along the route, well, we sort of were just making the best educated guess. Okay, well, so you were just guessing, like you didn't necessarily have all the information, but at the time, I don't know if anybody did. And I think this is, if somebody did have the answer out there, their country wouldn't have had COVID, but it certainly doesn't seem to be that there's any place in the world that wasn't affected. So Lawrence, these are always heavy conversations. These are big ones that it seems like because of the pandemic, because of the start of the squeaky wheel, because of all this, we typically have them. But if you're okay, why don't we bring our guests into the conversation now?
Sure. I mean, I met Mike, a number of years ago when he had a virtual reality headset, brought that into the office and made us look at a buffalo hunt virtually. So we were just following along there. And then, we made the connection to him, and pretty soon we have him involved in some of the Region 3 projects. So we're pretty excited.
I'm excited to talk to him. Folks, let's bring Mike Parks into the conversation. Well, Lawrence, now's the final, our chance to bring our guest onto the squeaky wheel. And as always, we always appreciate, Lawrence, every opportunity when you bring suggestions and names of people who make impact within our community. And I know we've been talking up Mr. Parks here a little bit, so let's bring him into our conversation and welcome him graciously to the squeaky wheel. Mike Parks, welcome. So,
thank you very much.
So Lawrence and I, we were, everybody knows our usual banter. We run into a whole bunch of things that we just sort of spent a little bit of time talking about, as usual, what's happening in the world of COVID. But now we want to get into some real positive things and some areas of positive connection within our community. And before we jump into our conversation about the Michif Games, which I know everybody's lined up excited to hear about, because I'm always learning a little bit more of getting an understanding around what Michif means within our Métis community. But before we jump into that, what often happens in conversation on the squeaky wheel is I like to know a little bit about the individual and where their connection with community came. A lot of our guests have heard the music background between Lawrence and his family, his dance background. Everybody generally knows my father was an Aboriginal veteran and a soldier. And when my dad was in his probably 50s, I was 20 years younger, and I realized it was important to him that he understood what Métis meant to him. And I knew at that time it was going to be important to me. So, you know, I know you're strong within our community and you're strong within the digital community. Why don't you share a little bit about your background, where Métis came and where that message came from, and why you're influenced by it now?
Okay. Yeah, it's definitely a little bit of a story for me because I have Métis from both sides of my family, but they both express it quite differently. And I didn't even know for sure that I was Métis or Indigenous until I was about 18 or 19 years old. Growing up, you know, learning about, I would say, Canada's past and hearing a little bit about the Métis, but not a whole lot. I knew that my mom's side of the family had some Indigenous in them, but I wasn't sure what. And it was just, as a child, like a fascination, I guess, of that kind of that older lifestyle. And I always thought it was cool. And, you know, how did really that all go from that to where we are now? So as an adult, when I found out I was Métis, I was like, why didn't I know sooner? What's going on? And I found out from my dad so my grandfather, his dad, was also Métis in a family of 12 siblings. And when he was 18 was when World War II was over. And he kind of still had the newspaper from that. And that was a picture of him in Winnipeg, like in a suit walking downtown. And so during those times for him, it was easier in his life if he was just white and not Métis, right? For very understandable reasons. So that's how he lived his whole life. And knowing that we're Métis, when I do see my extended family and all his siblings, it's like super obvious right away. Like, oh yeah, that's definitely a Métis family for sure. Whereas on my mom's side, it's definitely more, they wear it on their sleeve. They're more proud. But growing up, they always just said like, we're Native, right? That's just how they express it. And so I was like, all right. But there's music and art on both sides, and both sides, I would say, love the art of storytelling, and they share stories either of, well, mostly of their personal past, but of like the family history, and that kind of got me more interested in how we moved around and like what that real family history was. I kind of grew up all over Canada. I was born in Ontario. I lived in Manitoba. I lived in BC for majority of my childhood, and now I'm living here in Alberta. And so my family generally comes from Manitoba and a little bit like southwestern Ontario. So St. Laurent, Manitoba, which is mainly a French dialect of Michif that they speak. And that was my only exposure to the Michif language. And then on my granddad's side, he's actually from the Western Ontario part in the lakes. And so I was just finding out like, oh, well, how do we go from that to kind of where we are now? What's the history there? You know, and like the lessons to be learned, I guess, from our elders who kind of went through that. And then as time went on and it's kind of come out more public knowledge about the residential school system and all the other not so positive stuff that happened through the government, and kind of made more sense to me, I guess, as to why one side of the family decided to do it one way and the other side of the family kind of went the complete opposite route. So that was like a good grounding for me as to what my past is or my ancestry is. And then I've always had just a love of history in general, in school and really more so after school, learning about like the Roman history or the Egyptian, just going like super old. And so my love of history is just really aligned with my Métis history and learning that, because I don't have to go a world away to learn about that. I can talk to people here. People can point things out to me that are still here, and, you know, how it used to be not that long ago. Because instead of thinking, well, that was 150 years ago or 200 years ago, which seems really far away, it's a lot closer if you think of just generations, right? That was my great grandfather who was doing this. It was only 3 generations ago. That brings it closer to home. It's easier to understand. And so I connect with that when I learn about these Sorry. When I learn about these locations in Canada and kind of how the Métis are involved in these different spots.
Yeah.
Well, and I
just have a question about so what convinced you to grow your beard out the way you did? Because I think the only one who hasn't grown a winter facial hair is Ross yet. So, well, we can pan over to Jason if we can, just so we can take a look at his. But that one is kind of permanent all the time.
Well, I don't know if Ross wants this public or not, but I heard that he hasn't been growing it in yet. It's still a little patchy.
It still ends up being a little bit patchy on me, but yeah, no, Jason, you and Mike, you wear it very well. It looks great on you. It carries a very respectful Métis look. The Lawrence, on the other hand, that whatever he's got hanging across that mustache, his is starting to gray right out. That's for sure. Yeah. How you share that message, Mike, is actually fairly, I think we're finding a bit more common. The generations, as you point out, there were different generations where it was, don't share this information. Obviously, culturally, some people, you can see it definitely in their appearance, and it's not about deniability. It's about, I always find, still comfort. Everybody, it's a journey for everybody. There's not a long-standing history of 10 generations saying, look at me, I'm Métis. No, it's still something that comes forward. But the rabbit hole I've always found, and this is where we lead our guests when it comes to the squeaky wheel, is the more you learn, the more you realize this is your history. And if you're not willing to have a conversation about it or share it, well, you're kind of missing out on that opportunity. So you've helped open that up, as you've started to express. Now, you're the owner of Michif Media. You sit on the board of directors for the Calgary Games Developers Association. Let's talk a little bit about, because I know Lawrence wants to talk a little bit about this, and he has a little more experience because he helps support a lot of these projects. But let's talk a little bit about the Michif Media game. Maybe explain to us a little bit about where the framework of the game came from. And then I'd like to lead into a little bit about youth and elders and how the game, where it comes from.
Sure. So the framework of the game, kind of the goal of the game really, is just to teach the Michif language and, for me, the history. And so with the history comes like the culture, the ancestors, and any kind of folklore or religious aspect to it. That was the main goal of the game from the get-go, before there was even like an idea of what the game would be. Right? It's just, it needs to do these things. It's like, all right, that's a very easy thing to get behind. And then it just kind of started from, well, where's a good starting point on creating a game, right? Because it can be tricky. So you kind of see what's working out there in the wild and modify it to your own needs. And so that's where we came to a kind of a mix of a few different games. The game we're talking about, by the way, is called Pimotawin, which really means like travel or journeys. So we call it the Métis Pimotawin, so like the Métis journey, the Métis travels. And the game itself is one where you travel across Canada, collecting resources and interacting with the different forts and, so I'll say resources, but animals that are there to try and mimic what Métis life was like back then. But through that, we really just teach who our ancestors were, what they did, different aspects of our culture and how that may benefit you, and different aspects of our folklore and how that may benefit you, but also have a negative effect on what your gameplay is. But through that, it makes it fun, right? And fun and challenging. And then you can really play this game from very different aspects and do different things. Such as like hunting or go on a river trail and kind of hunt for beavers and give you like just a little taste of our Métis culture.
Now, I have a question, Lawrence, before I let Lawrence jump in. Is it, having not had the chance yet to other than be a part of conversations when you had talked previously about the development aspects of it, but does it follow a little bit, and this might date me a little bit, but choose your own adventure? Because I like the idea that it's okay to, you can there's consequences in video games. Right. And yeah, when you make a mistake, I find I learn more from my mistakes. but again, the opportunity to continue to play the game. But it sounds as though where the direction of the game is anytime you get more involved in the game, you're going to learn more about a little bit of language. You're going to learn a little bit more about some of the journeys were and the challenges that were there at the time. And we're a unique culture because, right, we have a very specific timeline of what was happening in the Red River area. Lawrence, you have the same thought there?
Well, like when we had Michif Media involved with Region 3 to develop the game, we always wanted to make sure that it was user-friendly at the end of the day and getting it to the students in the classrooms, number one. So they have some type of, sort of package that we offer classrooms so they can use it. And, it's all, it has riverways, cart trails, mentioning of forts, and then also translated into Michif, which was a whole other process. And we had Sky Blue Morin involved in a lot of the Michif translation. And she teaches I would say a northern Michif style language, which is Isle of Cross. And that's where my grandmother's from. That was a language that she was speaking. But I look at the way, and it's all packaged up into a looking fort. So I know we'll have that on the screen at some point, but people can kind of see what that looks like. But all of that was developed by Mike, and even the little individual pieces for the game board was developed by Mike too. And my question to Mike was, was that process challenging, or was it rewarding for the people developing it? Because I'm sure they weren't Métis that were building these little characters.
So yes to both. So it was rewarding and it was very challenging. And the people that I tapped to help produce some of the stuff, they all just kind of really loved everything they learned. So I'm just kind of like a go-between. I suck in as much information as I can. So talking with Sky Blue, our translator, who taught me an incredible amount about the Cree Michif dialect. And then also talking with Darcy, the historian, who helped me learn so much more about our Métis history. When talking to the producers to make some of the figurines or some of the little tents and cabins, they had questions as to why it has to be this way or that way. And so I would just spew out a bunch of information that they had no idea about. And all these people are Canadian. So to them was also them learning about Canadian history that they didn't know before. The design process took quite a while. This is something that I feel very blessed to get to contribute to the Métis this way. And so I don't want to, half-ass anything. And there's kind of like the artist paradox, right? Because you're never really happy with anything you make. It's always got to be perfect, but then can't wait for anything to be perfect because it would never get made. But then just so through learning about the history and the culture, you kind of learn some tidbits that could be used. Like, oh, okay, so we obviously use Red River carts. Everyone knows that. That should definitely be a figurine everyone can get behind and they recognize right away, right? What are some other pieces that people recognize, and just kind of going through that thought process to make the different iconic figurines. And if we're traveling across Canada, then, well, obviously they slept somewhere. And historically, we did sleep in our own tents that we made. It's similar to teepees in some fashion, and sometimes not, but made out of the same material, right? So, okay, let's make a trapper's tent, right? And then when we decided to make a home somewhere, that was usually out of wood, some type of log cabin, and we had a very Métis style for joining the pieces of wood together to make the house, and which is, I'm having a brain fart, and I forget what that is called, the interlocking joints. But I made the little cabins that you can build the exact same way to show that, right? And I try and explain everything in the game as to why things are the way they are. And it's all just trial and error, just making something, drawing it up and then having it produced and be like, oh, that's, change it slightly this way. And just keep doing that, slow iterations until we got to a point that we were really happy with.
Yeah, the dovetail style joints, where the logs kind of intersect, and that was sort of squared off and looking more European, but it was a log house. And we have a lot of dovetail joinery cabins already in place here. One is behind Fort Calgary at the Dean House. You can see the dovetail style from the old days. And apparently they could carry so much weight, they could do 2-story cabins because those dovetails are so strong.
Yeah, there's some beautiful examples within Calgary. You're right, Lawrence. We've gone down personally to see those two, those cabins down there, but there's a great history. So it sounds, Mike, like the game is almost the Mike Parks learning journey as well. There's kind of a combination and this is as much as I always laugh and joke about it, but we need multiple different tools in order to share our history. The squeaky wheel is one of those ones that was kind of lacking. We weren't connecting with people in a visual, in a humorous and a positive way. We lacked that. There's still some education that was happening, but I like the idea that your game is now is another tool that we can use. And as we've seen the rabbit hole, when you start a conversation in one spot, you the next question just propagates itself. Oh, well, Lawrence and I've talked about it. Well, if there was a Red River cart, well, where were they going? Well, that's why there's Métis cart trails or cart trails. Well, why were roads named certain ways? So I think that what a positive kind of message you're sending. Were there some key points that were essential, or did it all just sort of flow together? Like, was there something that you really wanted to share in that game?
There was a few things, and it's kind of some of the stuff that I've mentioned, which is so our ancestors is one of them. I wanted to talk about them, and it can be very tricky because there's not much written about them, and history is always written by the winning side, so the losing side doesn't get to write their own history, right? We are lucky in a sense that there's some stuff about our ancestors from ourselves, but mainly it's not secondhand sources. So that was a very challenging thing to try and get as accurate as possible. And same with the folklore. Métis folklore is also a challenge, and very interesting too, because I had to go all across Canada. This isn't just like the Albertan or the Prairies Métis. It's the entire Canadian Métis folklore. So I definitely spoke with some Métis here that weren't aware of all the folklore that I was bringing up. And the same with just pieces of our culture, because it's all kind of tied together, right? You can't really learn about our history without learning about our culture, which kind of therefore you start learning about the folklore secondhand. And with our culture, some of that you can still see today, right? Besides, like, everyone probably knows like the jigging, right? And our violins, sure, but then there's the ancestor storytelling, which for me and the other Métis families that I know of, if it's around Christmas or some other time of like family gathering, usually someone has like a guitar or some sort of instrument, and we usually end up kind of somewhat in a circle talking and celebrating, doing different fun things, and that seems to be something that's rooted in our culture from long ago, right? The reason why we do have a sash and what it was used for and things like that. And yeah, putting the language in there, because for me it's I guess a concern if the Métis language, Michif, becomes a dead language, essentially, right? Which I know is a concern for all Indigenous cultures. It's up to us to keep our language alive, and if we don't do it, no one's going to do it. So at least this was a way to try and help keep our language going on. And then the other part too, which is again all tied together, was just without being too, I guess, in your face about it, was all the forts that are on there that you kind of travel to. They're all Métis built forts. So by traveling to each fort, and you end up going from Ontario, heading straight west through the different provinces, and then you loop up going north, right, through the Yukon, Northwest Territories. Just that alone shows how far outspread we were, which then kind of goes back to our culture, why we had the Red River carts, what we did with them, right? And that just kind of expresses the whole thing. So in having those pieces that I really wanted to share, really did inform the game a lot, because it's hard to do one without the other properly.
Mm-hmm. So where do you find the game? That's the big question. I'm sure people are probably wondering that.
Yeah.
At Region 3 office. Call up Lawrence.
Yeah.
Everybody already knows that's easy enough that they could call him up. I guess one of the questions that I had was, because it's going to lead into to our next little point of conversation is 100 years ago, what was the Michif word for virtual media? I guess I'm curious as to, I'm sure that if Michif has incorporated it now, it's probably Michif, it's probably virtual media. But so your group, the Michif Media, and folks, if you want to read a little bit about more and understanding the virtual aspect of some of the stuff you've developed, michifmedia.com, talk a little bit about the relationship, because what we're trying to figure out is what are all of the tools that we can start using to engage our youth? How is virtual media playing a role, and how does it impact the connection with youth? What are some of the strengths that are happening there that you see? And talk a little bit about Michif Media.
Yeah, so I'll have to separate a little bit, because the virtual aspect of it has been growing as an industry in itself, which I say is one silver lining about the pandemic. It's kind of forced everyone to go virtual, which then forced a lot of people to figure out how to do virtual learning. Michif Media initially was created to do museum experiences. So still interested in education, but I just saw museums as a natural starting point for anything in virtual reality or augmented reality, since you're really mostly staring at static exhibits, some sort of statue or figurine, and this kind of tells you about it, and then you read it and kind of walk on. It would be a lot cooler if it was VR and you could be in, whatever it was showing, right? Especially for medieval times or Roman times, it's a lot more fantastical or romantic. So we started from there, and then we started working with Port Calgary and doing some exhibits there and just kind of showcasing the possibilities of VR and how the public reacted to that. And they all reacted very positively. Especially with augmented reality, which is usually on like your phone or tablet, any kind of device like that, maybe someday soon smart glasses, which is just putting a digital object, but it's still interacting kind of with the real world space. And that, actually, this year has really made that a lot more digestible for people. Kids, it's very natural. The challenge with doing it with kids is if it's too slow, it doesn't work right away. They want things like now, fast, super quick. Right? And if it doesn't, then they get bored and they just go away.
Right.
And you're like, no, just give me 2 minutes, right? And they're like, done. And working with our elders, the challenge there is if they just don't understand the technology itself. But same thing too, if it's not working or it's kind of going slow, it just gets really confusing for everybody. There's always a bit of like a technical hurdle to kind of get over. But there's a lot more places, especially in the education space, that are looking on how they can bring their lessons online. One of our biggest projects that we did was actually a D-Day virtual tour, and we followed the Canadian regiments from D-Day itself up until about the end of September and the beginning of October. And that was like an initial phase of the liberation of Europe. And so we went to all these different locations and took 360 photography and 360 video and put that online as a tour for people to kind of go and experience and follow that story. What was also very interesting for me to do that, besides just loving history and being another like Mike learning tour, is I started talking with the historians there on some of the Indigenous veterans who served. And I found out, and I was at the spot, and so I took a panorama there too. The first recorded kill with against a tank, first of all, but with a spring-powered rocket launcher, which someone had a kind of like, not a replica, they had an old version of it, so I picked it up, and it's really, really heavy, and it's spring-loaded, so they have to like force the rocket down and the spring would compress. And then they picked this giant tube up and they hid behind the corner of a house, and then a German Panzer tank came right beside the house, and then they shot at point blank range, and it opened up a huge hole and took out the tank. And that was a Métis individual who did that.
Huh. And these are the kind of messages we have to, share more of. Like, who are those individuals that have had a impactful role within organizations, within communities? And I think hopefully our goal here and the idea of the game and reconciliation are starting to share those messages. And, there's a lot of history behind the government not being supportive and the military removing identity. But why? Maybe the identity has always been there, always should be there, should be celebrated. And how do we, continue to share the message? So I'm excited to learn more. I know when our office opens up, we'll have a better opportunity to start really playing the game, getting our hands on it. I remember seeing some of the pieces you're developing, and it looks wonderful. Lawrence, maybe you could thank Mike, because I know I'm excited that we're going to finally get a chance in the future as this pandemic hopefully comes to a completion. But maybe help close out the time here.
Well, one thing that we're sort of working with the Squeaky Wheel, of course, is the Region 3 channel that we're doing, but we're going to be adding another playlist of a Michif podcast. And I know that's something in the future we're going to be looking at Mike supporting and getting a language speaker in to do the podcast, which will be a different look for Region 3. But in this virtual world we live in now, that's one of the projects we have coming in the next little bit. So we'll keep everybody posted on that in 2021. We look forward to more stuff coming from Mike and Michif Media to Region 3.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I know you've been a strong contributor, and I know that's probably not going to end. And thanks for being a part of our journey, because we're all trying to figure it out. I know very few Michif words. Please don't ask me any of them right now, because I'm just going to embarrass myself.
Well, it's the same for me, even though I learned a whole lot. It's learning second languages is definitely not my forte. So, ongoing learning experience for me, and anything that I can do to help contribute to the community even more is, just hit me up.
Well, thank you. And folks, make sure you hit his website, because it's absolutely beautiful, michifmedia.com.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. What a delightful fella. I know we've sat in a number of conversations with him and the games and his approach to how he was developing it. But until you actually get a chance to talk to him and hopefully we get a chance to sit and fool with the game ourselves, I'm happy that we're finally there. And I'm happy to see somebody who was so positive, wanting to share a message. That's the best part of it, right? It wasn't just somebody who was putting it together because he had nothing better to do. No, he was learning. He's learning as well as he's teaching us, and he's developing it and utilizing his skills. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we're all learning, as the days go on, we're learning until, we leave the earth pretty much about who we are, and it's just that cycle, right? But it's, I'm constantly learning, with this job day to day about who I am or my culture and all that. And very grateful for that. And, Mike's on that journey too.
And for us, we get to see these people behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, and share their conversation on the Squeaky Wheel, because all this stuff might be happening in the background, but we need to bring that a little bit to the foreground so everybody else gets a chance to see there's a lot that's still happening. So, we talked about a little earlier, the stuff that was happening within the region, and we always appreciate the time that you work with that. So yeah, big shout out to Mike Parks. Appreciate his contribution and continue to look forward to it. So Lawrence, let's talk a little bit about rants.
Okay.
The thing that's still driving me crazy is everybody's racing around out there. And I get it, folks. You're all in a hurry to get someplace, and I bring it up every week. It gets dark at 4:30. Turn your lights on in your car. You know what? Just leave them on. Because I can't tell you how many people I get behind and they don't have their lights on. It's hard to see. It's already dark at 4:30. Folks, I get it. You're more important than anybody else to get anywhere, but it's okay to slow down a little bit, realize you're going to get there, and have a look at that car and make sure your light's on.
Yeah. I mean, right now we're in mine's not really a rant, but more of a comment. We're in a lockdown now.
Yeah. People
are sort of picking and choosing what they're doing, and it's Christmas season, so we know the malls are busy. We can see that when we drive by, the parking lots are pretty much full. I'm not sure what they're doing to reduce the capacity inside, because I think what they say is a 25% capacity.
15, I think.
Oh, it's at 15. Yeah. So, I see, you kind of gauge that when you see the parking lot. Well, how are they doing that on the inside, right?
That's funny you mentioned. I had to run to pick up some stuff for my wife today, or just one small thing at Canadian Tire, and I saw the parking lot. I'm like, you know what? That's not too busy. No lineup outside. There was a security guard. So big shout out to Canadian Tire, who's doing their job. And thank you again to all of those people who are still committed to their work, committed to our economy, and the essential service groups that are on the front line. So yeah, no, I agree with you, Lawrence.
Yeah, I mean, Costco people are lining them outside. Canadian Tire, they line up. But then when I go to some other areas or some grocery stores, there's not a lot of lines up on the outside. So I'm just wondering about that. And then also, in terms of, but how do they regulate that? How do they enforce it? That's the other issue too, because you can't expect people who are, working there as employees, and they don't have a security background or anything that's, to really enforce that type of stuff. It gets tough.
That's a good point. And folks, listeners out there, send us the frustrations that you have, but realize that those people who are working there are there to help you. Yeah. You don't have to be so hard with them. And, everybody's, we're just seeing, and we read too much that people are so upset. Anybody who's told that, sorry, you have to wear a mask, that person didn't likely make the policy, but they're trying to adhere to it. So folks, let's please do that. So send those frustrations, send those emails to us, tsw@métis3.org. Make sure you ask us any of your questions. Lawrence and I always appreciate supporting you. Thank you to Jason, who's always holding up on our back end for us. And the time that we get to spend together sharing conversation from a Métis perspective is very important. So you can find us at tsw@métis3.org on our website. And we always welcome your questions. Fire everything off. Lawrence, close us out. And
also hit the subscribe button. It takes, that little index finger and just to go like this for like a half a second. And you'll get all the updates. You'll get notified when we have a new episode on. So just hit subscribe.
I've done our Zoom. That's on our website. It's available. So if you want to learn how to teach a family member doing it with Zoom, you can find it on our website. But also the next one I'm going to do, Lawrence, is going to help people that they can click a link and they can watch how I take them through subscribing to our to our podcast. We're doing great. Numbers are going up all the time. Always appreciative, and we're getting a lot more interest from all of the educational communities and the message that we share. So folks, thanks for spending your time here today on the Squeaky Wheel.